Have you ever been trying to write an argument or any other type of writing and you spent all this time thinking and you really didn't get that far because you weren't even sure what to say? Well, hopefully I can help you figure out how to write an argument a little bit better with today's Argumentative Writing Skills video on writing a logical argument with evidence. This is our proficiency rubric we are working with for today. Feel free to pause and read the proficient and highly proficient columns to see what you should be hopefully better at by the end of this video. And our agenda for today is the piece paragraph introduction, and we'll go through the 5 parts: the point, introduction, evidence, citation, and explanation. And quick disclaimer, I'm trying to keep this video as short as I possibly can, so I won't explain some things in detail. If you want more information, look it up later. Let me introduce the piece paragraph to you in case you haven't watched the previous video I talked about the piece paragraph in. So the piece paragraph is a structure for writing clear and convincing body paragraphs in argument or informational essays, and each letter stands for a key part of the paragraph. So P stands for point or the topic sentence, I stands for introduction of the evidence, E is the evidence, C is the citation about the evidence, and then the E is the explanation of the evidence and point. So when you use the piece paragraph, your writing is easier to follow, more convincing, and academically strong. So why should you use the piece paragraph format? Because it helps you organize your thinking so you can have strong, logical paragraphs that stay focused and purposeful. It'll also help you build credibility because you're introducing your sources and citing them properly so the readers trust that your information is more reliable. And think of it like a checklist for you and your teacher. So it gives you steps to follow to make sure you have all the parts, and it gives your teacher a clear structure to assess. So when we talk about piece paragraphs and body paragraphs, we are talking about these middle paragraphs. We are not talking about the introduction, which we just talked about in the previous video, and we're not talking about the conclusion, which we'll cover in a later video. So to reemphasize, the piece paragraphs or the body paragraphs are the middle paragraphs in an essay or text. Those are what we're talking about today. So let's start with the first section of the piece paragraph, P, which stands for point. And the point is the topic sentence, and it's going to tell the reader what this specific paragraph is going to explain. The point of this paragraph should help support the argument in your thesis statement, the one in your introduction paragraph that's guiding the whole essay or writing. The rest of the paragraph should be explaining this point further. So when you write the point, you want to make sure it is one of the reasons that supports the argument you presented in your thesis statement. So it should support your thesis statement as one of the reasons why you think you are correct. You do want to make it convincing and fact-based because you do want to prove all of your reasons with facts. You don't include evidence yet in your point because that comes in a later part. Here's an example of a point sentence. So we have one of the most important reasons teachers deserve higher pay is that it helps schools attract and keep qualified educators. So the point should show what the thesis of the entire essay is. So we see teachers deserve higher pay. We're talking about one of the reasons for that. So that is part of your thesis statement. And then we also see in this point what the point of this paragraph will be about, which is it helps schools attract and keep qualified educators. So that's the vibe of the point. It should refer back to your thesis statement and then provide one of the reasons it is correct. To show you another example, a key reason energy drinks should be banned for minors is that they pose serious health risks to developing bodies. So we have the thesis of the entire essay built in the beginning, that energy drinks should be banned for minors. And the point of this paragraph, or one of the reasons we believe this, is that they pose serious health risks to developing bodies. So we're going to take a quick example look at a piece paragraph within this essay. So we're going to zoom in on this one right here. So our point in this particular example is this very first sentence. Unlike community gardens, food banks are designed to deliver fast assistance during times of urgent need. So think of the point sentence like the foundation of a house, just in the same way that it's kind of important for your house to stay standing. With that foundation, your paragraph doesn't really stay standing or make sense unless you have that point sentence. Now let's talk about I for introduction. This is where you introduce the evidence you're about to use to support your point. So the introduction usually includes where you got the evidence from, so information about your source, and why this source of evidence is credible or relevant to your point. You want to use the introduction because it helps prepare the reader to trust your evidence before you share it. Tips for a good introduction include making sure that your evidence is actually credible or relevant. Otherwise, the introduction won't do any good if it's a bad source. It's always good to mention anything about the source of the evidence that lots of people would quickly find trustworthy or honest. So think of a reputable news source or a person that someone trusts. It's always good to mention that person in your introduction. Usually it's good to either share the title of the source or briefly explain what the source is about, again, because you're introducing the evidence and why it's credible. But the biggest tip of all is the introduction is not going to be its own sentence. It's going to flow immediately into the evidence, and I'll show you an example of that in the next slide. So here's some examples of introductions. So this example says, a 2022 report on turnover rates for educational staff published by the Economic Policy Institute found that, ... So this introduction version just describes what the source is and who created it. And then example 2 of an introduction would look like Dr. Anders Pilkington, a pediatrician at the Mayo Clinic and medical professor for the University of Minnesota, discusses the negative effects of energy drinks on children's hearts when he says ... And this introduction version will highlight the person specifically and their credentials and expertise. So the first one talks about the source itself. The second one focuses on the person who wrote the source. Notice that in both of these, there's no period that's ending the introduction. Notice it flows into the evidence, which is not mentioned here, but you can see the quotation starting that evidence. So we've got a comma here, we've got nothing here. Either way, these are not full sentences by themselves. Our introduction in this example paragraph is in the book, Feeding the Need, A History of Food Relief in America. Sociologist Jamie Lynn explains that. So we've introduced the source, we've introduced the author to hopefully add some credibility to our evidence. And think of the introduction of your paragraph like the framework of a house. It kind of helps structure the rest of the house, just as your introduction kind of structures the evidence that you're going to need for the rest of your paragraph. Now, we have E for evidence. This is obviously the direct quote or the paraphrase detail that is supporting your point. So it should be accurate, relevant, and specific. Types of credible evidence includes factual articles, statistical data, expert quotes and testimonials, scientific research, historical documents. I want to kind of do a little shameless plug here that you should always check for evidence credibility. If you've been in my class, we've talked about this chart quite a few times already. There are 8 things you want to look for in a piece of evidence to make sure that it is credible. The more yeses you mark on this, the better that source is. I'm not going to go over these in detail, but feel free to pause and read the 8 things that hopefully you see most, if not all of, in any of your sources. Now, some tips for including your evidence. You want to make sure that it actually supports the point at the beginning of the sentence. Otherwise, what's the point of the evidence if it's not going to prove your point? Don't choose a long quote. This should not take up more than 1 to 2 short sentences because you just want to focus on your writing and not the other person's writing. And we do recommend choosing only one part of the quote, the one that best supports your point. So you can always use ellipses to skip parts of the quote you don't need to share. I talked about this in a previous video. And then you can also paraphrase the quote rather than writing it word for word if you think you can do a clearer or more interesting job saying it in your own words. Just know that if you paraphrase evidence, you don't need to use quotation marks. And your biggest tip, you're still not going to use a period at the end of the evidence. Again, I will show you where that goes in a minute. Some examples of evidence include teachers earn about 23% less than other college-educated workers with similar experience. So you'll notice that this quote, it did not actually use an ellipses, so ignore that. But we do have our quotation marks to show that this is a direct quote. We are writing it word for word from a source that we found. And then example 2 says, energy drinks should not be included in children's diets because they can cause heart problems, anxiety, and sleep disturbances. And you'll notice there's no quotation marks around this because this quote is paraphrased because just pretend you know that the original quote was very long and used very complex language, so we reworded it to make it shorter and clearer. Our evidence for this paragraph is here. It says food banks rely on donations and partnerships with grocery chains to quickly supply meals to families experiencing crisis situations. You'll see it's in quotation marks, so this is a direct quote, not a paraphrased one. And one thing I want to show you here is there's still no period at the end of this evidence, and I want to show you here There's a period here that should not be there. Ignore this. Pretend that doesn't exist. There is no period here, though. So remember that evidence should not have a period. At the end, the period will go in one final spot, which I'll show you in the next section. You do want to think of your evidence like the walls of a house, so it helps hold the house up and make it a house, the same way that a point kind of holds your paragraph up and makes it a valid point. Without it, it's not a real house, it's not a real paragraph. Now we have our C for citation, and our citation in a piece paragraph is the reference to the source where your evidence came from. There are different types of citations. The one that we'll talk about today is the in-text citation, or the one that goes in the text. It's always going to be inside parentheses, and it is usually, pretty much always placed immediately after the direct quote or the paraphrased evidence is. So you want it immediately after whatever evidence you used. There are a few different ways to organize this called formatting styles. The most common formatting styles are APA, MLA, and Chicago. For the purpose of this class, we'll be using MLA format. Why do in-text citations exist? Well, you want to show your audience that the evidence is not made up. You also want to give credit to the person or group who did the work to produce this information, because it's not your work that did this, it was someone else's. And putting the citation immediately after the evidence helps you find where all of the sources are used in an essay, because typically this paragraph is inside of a full essay, and if you know, most essays usually have a list of sources listed at the end, so the in-text citation just makes it easier to see where all of the sources and the back of that essay have been used within the essay. And so you know that period that I told you did not exist in the introduction and evidence, it's going to show up in the citation. So let me show you what that looks like. Example 1, we've got our quote here, and then we have in parentheses Harris 89 parentheses period. So notice the period ends after the parentheses. This is a basic in-text citation. So Harris is the author's last name, and then the 89 is a page number. It is specifically the page number that the evidence is found on. I want to note that there's no comma here. A lot of people like putting a comma here. For MLA format, there is no comma. It's just author last name, and then the page number the quote was found on. Second example, we have in parentheses, we have quotation mark, voices of industry, quotation mark, parentheses, period. What this means is that no author was listed, so we used the first 2 to 3 words of the source's title. Again, because in the end of an essay, if you didn't have an author listed, the first thing on that full citation would be the title. And then do know there is no number here, and that means that the source is a single page, so there's no reason to put a page number because there's only one page for that entire source. So you can just leave the number off in that case. And then our final example of an in-text citation, you see this one's pretty long. So we've got our parentheses, we've got in quotation marks, how cats, so you can see this is a title. But now you see timestamps, and it is written in hour, minute, second to dash hour, minute, second. So what this means is this is either a video or a song. So if you're using video or music for a citation, you'll use timestamps because obviously there's not pages involved, but time limits. So you'll put in the range of the time where the quote that you used was heard. If you're using videos, then this part will be the name of the video. So since this is a name, then this is a video that this source is. But if you're using a song, you'll actually use the name of the artist. So for example, if you were quoting a song by Taylor Swift, this would say Taylor Swift right here. And our citation here in this example paragraph is right here. It is parentheses, Lynn 112, parentheses, period. So this is the author's last name, and this quote was found on in the book's page 112. Think of your citation like a building permit. So the building permit lets you know that the house is credible and that someone with authority has stamped and said, yes, this is approved, this is good. In the same way, the citation says, yes, this is an approved source, this is good, and you should believe it. And finally, we get to E for explanation. The explanation shows how the evidence supports your point and why it matters to the reader or the world. So think of the explanation as an answer to the reader's question, why should I care about any of this? So when you're writing a good explanation, the last part of any good argument paragraph, this section should be longer than the other 4 parts combined. This is a very big part, which you'll see in a little bit. It should explain the connection between the point and the evidence. So sometimes people need that spelled out. You want to assume your audience needs you to explain the obvious parts of the argument. Even if you think people should make that connection, some people don't make that connection immediately, so you need to kind of spell it out and explain it as if they don't understand how the point proves the evidence, or how the evidence proves the point. And while you're doing this, you do want to make the reader care about this information. So let's look at some examples of explanations. I'm actually just going to show these and have you pause and read them yourselves because I don't want to make this video any longer than it already is. So these are 2 examples of explanations. I'll let you pause whenever. Just know you can see these are multiple sentences long, much longer than the other sections. So pause here, take a look and read. And now we'll move on. So this is the explanation section for this paragraph. Again, I'm not going to read it out loud. Feel free to look through it yourself, though. Again, the main point is you're trying to explain how the point proves, or how the evidence proves the point. And as you can see, it is longer than the other 4 parts combined. That is a sign of a good explanation. So think of your explanation like the decor inside of a house. So it's not necessary technically in a technical sense, but it actually really is if you think about it, because the house really isn't livable or interesting until you have the decor and the furniture inside. In the same way, you could just give me the evidence to prove the point, but it's really not that interesting and I'm not going to care about it. But if you explain it and you give me something interesting to think about, then I'm more interested in what you have to say. In the same way that decor makes a house more interesting. All right, let's look at an example just to really drive home the idea of a piece paragraph in the 5 parts. I'm not going to read through this whole paragraph, so feel free to pause. You can see that it's color-coded, so pause, read for a second. So we see the P for point here, it's in pink. So it's at the beginning, it's explaining what this paragraph is going to be about. You got your I for introduction. We are introducing the evidence, where it came from and who wrote it and why it's credible. We have our E for evidence, this yellow section here. This is our direct quote that's supposed to be supporting the point that we made at the beginning. C, citation, that's our little green section here. So we're showing the timestamp of where this quote occurred inside of a video. And then E is our explanation, and it's letting us know all of the information we need to know about how the evidence proves the point. And that is writing a logical argument using the piece paragraph with evidence. So in the future, make sure that you are writing a piece paragraph so it feels like a solid home and it's got all of the stuff you need to make it a home. And if you're missing any of those parts, that home is going to collapse and it's not going to be a good paragraph or a good argument. So hopefully this information makes a lot more sense and you feel like you are a lot more proficient in this than you were many minutes ago. Happy logical argument writing, and I will see you in the next